In the heart of Europe, more than 500 years ago, there was a summer unlike any other. The year was 1518, and the bustling city of Strasbourg stood proudly along the banks of the River Rhine. It was a city of cobblestone streets, timber-framed houses, and a population that carried both the burdens and the joys of a changing world. Merchants shouted their prices in the busy marketplace. Children played by the river's edge, and the tolling bells of the cathedral echoed across the rooftops, marking the hours of prayer and rest. To the outside world, Strasbourg was ordinary, vivid, alive, and full of the rhythms of daily life. But within its walls, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something so strange, so haunting, that it would echo in memory for centuries. The story begins, as many stories do, quietly. There was no warning, no prophecy, no sense that the city would soon become the stage of a bizarre and terrifying mystery. It began with a single woman stepping into the street on an ordinary July morning. Her name was Frau Trophäa. Little is known of her life, whether she was wealthy or poor, whether she was happy or burdened. But on that morning she became the first note in a melody that none could understand. She walked to the center of her neighborhood, the summer sun pressing down on the rooftops, and without a word, she began to dance. At first, it seemed harmless. Her feet tapped against the stones, her body swayed with an invisible rhythm. Perhaps, thought the onlookers, she was celebrating. Perhaps she had been struck with joy or was mocking some unseen tune. Neighbors peered from their doorways, curious and amused. A few laughed. A child clapped his hands. It was unusual, yes, but hardly alarming. But the minutes turned into hours, and Frau Trophäa did not stop. Her movements grew more frantic, her face flushed, sweat pouring down her brow. The laughter of the crowd began to fade into unease. This was not a festival. There was no music, no fiddler, no drum to guide her steps. The rhythm was inside her, unseen, unstoppable, and merciless. By nightfall, she had not collapsed. Exhaustion trembled in her limbs, yet still she moved. Some begged her to rest, others crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Rumors spread quickly through the narrow streets. Was she bewitched, possessed, cursed by God for some hidden sin? Whatever the cause, Strasbourg had become the stage for something eerie and unnatural. On the second day, she was still dancing. Her feet bled against the stones. Her eyes stared ahead, unfocused, as though she were trapped in a dream she could not wake from. Crowds gathered in larger numbers, drawn by morbid curiosity. Merchants abandoned their stalls, children clung to their mothers, and even the city's magistrates heard whispers of the woman who could not stop. By the third day, something even stranger occurred. Others began to join her. It was not by invitation, nor by conscious choice. One by one, men and women watching in the crowd began to twitch, to step, to sway with the same wild energy. A tailor dropped his tools and spun into the square, arms flailing. A baker's wife stumbled forward, her skirts whirling. Within hours, a handful of dancers had become dozens, each trapped in the same feverish trance. Their bodies moved as though commanded by an unseen hand. They spun, they stomped, they collapsed only to rise again, their muscles refusing to rest. The city watched in horror as the dance spread. By the end of the first week, nearly 30 people were moving day and night without pause. The square echoed with the sound of countless feet striking against the stones, a dreadful percussion that carried into every home. Families dragged their loved ones away, only to watch them slip back into the crowd as though magnetized. The city, once proud and orderly, was slowly unraveling before its own eyes. The magistrates, men of law and reason, struggled to explain the madness. The priests spoke of divine punishment. The physicians whispered of overheated blood, of humors thrown out of balance. Yet none could deny what they saw. Ordinary men and women caught in a grip stronger than reason, stronger than the will to live or die. And Frau Trophäa, the first dancer, was still moving among them, her body trembling, her face pale, yet her feet unwilling to stop. As the days turned into nights, the spectacle grew darker. Some dancers screamed in pain as their bodies gave way. Their hearts raced beyond endurance. Their lungs burned, yet still they twirled and stomped. Some collapsed into seizures, shaking against the cobblestones before rising again, as if compelled by a force they could not resist. Mothers danced beside their children. Husbands watched helplessly as their wives spun into exhaustion. The city, once alive with the sounds of trade and laughter, now resounded with gasps, cries, and the relentless pounding of feet. And though none could understand why, all felt the same fear, that whatever curse had fallen upon Frau Trophäa was now spreading like a fire through the city. By the second week of the strange affliction, Strasbourg had changed. What had begun as a curiosity was now a crisis. The marketplace, once filled with the hum of bargaining and laughter, had become a stage for madness. Hundreds gathered not to buy bread or grain, but to watch the dancers. Some came in fear, whispering prayers as they crossed themselves and hurried away. Others came in fascination, unable to look away from the spectacle. The sound was relentless, feet pounding against stone, the rasping breath of exhaustion, cries of agony mixed with laughter that seemed not entirely human. It was as if the city itself had fallen under a spell. By now, as many as 50 people were caught in the dance, and still more joined each day. It did not matter if they were old or young, wealthy or poor. A housewife might step into the street and suddenly begin to spin. A priest might collapse during prayer, only to rise and sway with the same dreadful rhythm. Those who resisted too long often found themselves trembling, their legs twitching until they too were claimed by the dance. The city council, desperate for answers, called upon physicians. These men of medicine examined the dancers, checked their pulses, studied the wild movement of their limbs. Their conclusion was grim. This was not witchcraft, nor possession, but a sickness of the body. They believed the blood was overheated, boiling inside the veins, forcing the body into motion. To cure it, they declared, the dancers must not be stopped. They must dance until the fever burned itself away. And so, the council ordered musicians into the streets. Drummers and pipers were summoned, their instruments echoing across the squares. Platforms were built so that the dancers could perform openly, their movements accompanied by melody. The hope was that music would guide the sickness toward its end, that exhaustion and rhythm might cleanse the blood. But the effect was not the one they hoped for. The music only encouraged more to join. What began with 50 became 100. What was once confined to one square now spilled across the city. Families wept as they saw loved ones vanish into the crowd of stamping feet. Some tried to hold them back, only to be pulled in themselves, their bodies trembling, until they too surrendered to the strange compulsion. Day after day, night after night, the madness continued. Men collapsed with their hearts pounding too fast to endure. Women fainted, their bodies limp, only to rise again as though invisible strings pulled them upright. A mother clutched her child and begged for mercy, but even the young were not spared. Some accounts tell of children no more than 7 or 8 years old, spinning with frantic energy until they fell unconscious. By the height of the plague, more than 400 people were said to be dancing. Entire streets were filled with their staggering forms. Merchants no longer dared open their stalls, for the dancers flooded the marketplace from dawn until dusk. The smell of sweat, of blood from torn feet, of sickness and despair filled the summer air. Priests walked among the crowds, sprinkling holy water, chanting prayers. Some whispered that the dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr long associated with convulsions and fits. Perhaps, they said, the people of Strasbourg had offended him, and now his wrath moved through their bodies like fire. The council, torn between faith and reason, did not know what to believe. Some argued for repentance, fasting, and prayer. Others insisted that the sickness was physical and demanded more musicians, more space, more dance. But the longer it continued, the more death shadowed the streets. Accounts tell of people dancing themselves to death, hearts bursting, bodies collapsing, never to rise again. By some estimates, dozens perished in this way, their final breaths leaving them mid-step, their faces frozen in agony. And yet the living continued, unable to stop even as they trampled past the fallen. Families grew desperate. Some dragged their loved ones into their homes, tying them to chairs or locking them inside. But even then, the afflicted would thrash, cry, and beg to be released, as though some invisible force demanded their return to the square. Many escaped and ran back to the streets, where the dance swallowed them once again. The city's physicians, realizing their cure had failed, could offer nothing more. They wrote of blood too hot, of humors unbalanced, but their remedies were powerless. The priests, too, struggled. Prayer and blessing did little to slow the tide. Some whispered that Strasbourg itself had been cursed, that the sins of the people had drawn down punishment from God. Others muttered of darker forces, of demons walking unseen, laughing as mortals wore themselves into the grave. The sound of the city was no longer ordinary. By night, the streets echoed with screams and song, the drumming of heels against stone. By day, the same relentless rhythm filled the air, accompanied by the mournful cries of families watching helplessly. Strasbourg was unraveling. In the countryside beyond the walls, peasants told stories of the madness. Travelers arriving in the city carried tales of the dancers back to their villages, where fear spread like wildfire. Some feared the plague might leap from Strasbourg to the next town, consuming all in its path. Others insisted it was punishment only for the city, a curse meant to stay within its gates. But inside Strasbourg, those who had not yet been taken lived in dread. Each twitch of the muscles, each strange dream, each restless night filled them with terror. Would they too step into the street tomorrow and find themselves caught in the endless dance? By the end of July, the situation was unbearable. Hundreds still danced, dozens had died, and the city teetered on the edge of collapse. The council, out of answers, turned fully to the church. They declared that the only hope was divine mercy. A plan was made. The dancers would be led not to the marketplace, not to the squares, but to a holy shrine. They would be brought before the image of Saint Vitus himself, and there, through prayer and ritual, the curse would be lifted. And so, Under the burning sun, the dancers were gathered. Some staggered, barely conscious, yet still moving. Others screamed, begged, or sang as they were carried forward. Musicians played, not to encourage, but to guide them, leading the staggering mass away from the city centre and toward the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby mountains. It was a desperate gamble, a plea to the heavens that faith might succeed where reason had failed. And as the dancers moved toward the shrine, Strasbourg watched with a mix of fear, hope, and dread. For weeks they had lived in the shadow of madness, and now, perhaps, they would see its end. The decision to march the afflicted to the shrine of Saint Vitus was not taken lightly. Strasbourg had exhausted every worldly remedy. Physicians had failed, music had only worsened the affliction, and families were on the brink of despair. Faith was all that remained. The shrine stood some miles away, nestled at the foot of the Vosges Mountains. Pilgrims had travelled there for generations, leaving offerings to St. Vitus in hope of cures for trembling limbs, seizures, and ailments of the mind. To many, it was a place of mercy and healing. To the desperate city, it was their final chance. The procession began at dawn. The afflicted were gathered from the streets, men and women who had danced without pause for weeks. Some had to be carried, their bodies exhausted, yet still twitching. Others staggered forward on their own, their feet torn and bloody, their eyes glazed with exhaustion. A few sang strange hymns as they went, words slurred and broken, as though caught between prayer and delirium. Priests walked alongside them, chanting psalms and sprinkling holy water. Musicians played slow, somber tunes, not to inflame the dancing, but to guide it, shaping the chaos into a weary march. Families followed behind, some weeping, some silent, all hoping that this pilgrimage would end the nightmare. The road was lined with onlookers. Peasants from nearby villages crossed themselves as the dancers passed, whispering of curses and divine wrath. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, peering out at the staggering figures. To see so many moving as one, hundreds caught in the same dreadful rhythm, was to see something beyond human reason. At last, they reached the shrine. A small chapel stood there, its walls darkened with centuries of smoke from candles and incense. Inside, an image of Saint Vitus waited, painted with the serene face of a martyr who had suffered in his youth, his name long associated with trembling and convulsions. To the faithful, he was the only one who could lift such a plague. The priests wasted no time. They placed the dancers before the shrine, one by one, and performed rites of cleansing. Offerings were laid at the altar, bread, coins, and tokens of devotion. Some dancers were made to wear red shoes, a ritual garment tied to the saint, in hope that their steps would finally cease. Prayers rose like smoke in the chapel. Families knelt and begged for mercy. The dancers, though weak, continued to sway and twitch, yet within the holy walls the frenzy seemed to lessen. Some collapsed and did not rise again, not from death, but from sudden release, as though the invisible strings had been cut. Others quieted, trembling as they finally sank into sleep, their first true rest in weeks. For many, the pilgrimage marked the end. The shrine became a sanctuary, a place where the madness loosened its grip. Not all were cured. Some remained trapped in strange movements, their minds lost to exhaustion. But enough were calmed that Strasbourg believed deliverance had come. And yet, the mystery remained. The city was left scarred by what it had witnessed. Dozens had died, perhaps more. Commerce had faltered, families had been torn apart, and fear lingered in every street. The question echoed in every home and tavern. What had caused this madness? Some clung to the belief in Saint Vitus. They said the people had angered him, and the dance had been his punishment. The shrine, therefore, was his mercy, a reminder of his power, both terrible and kind. Pilgrims continued to visit long after the plague faded, offering prayers to avoid such a fate. Others sought more earthly explanations. Physicians returned to their writings, trying to make sense of the affliction. Some argued it was caused by overheated blood, a fever of the humours. Others whispered of poisoned food, grain infected with ergot fungus. This strange mould, growing on rye in damp summers, could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and delirium when eaten. Perhaps, they suggested, the bread of Strasbourg had carried the seeds of madness. Yet not all were convinced. If it were ergot, why had the victims danced in unison, rather than scattered in private seizures? Why had the affliction spread not like a disease of the body, but like an idea, contagious through sight and sound? Here, another theory emerged. Mass hysteria. The people of Strasbourg, crushed beneath the weight of famine, disease, and fear, might have collapsed into collective madness. The summer of 1518 had been cruel. Crops had failed in recent years, hunger gnawed at the bellies of the poor, and disease still lurked from the plagues of the past. Add to this the heavy hand of religion, the constant warnings of sin and damnation, and perhaps the people's minds had simply broken. One woman's dance may have ignited a fire of suggestion, spreading like a storm through a population desperate for release. The idea was troubling. It meant that the plague had not come from God, nor from poison, but from within the human heart itself. Fear and suffering had been enough to drive hundreds into madness. And still, the story grew stranger in the retelling. Some whispered of demons, mocking spirits that had seized the people. Others spoke of secret cults, of forbidden rituals that had slipped into the streets. A few even claimed that Strasbourg had been cursed by its enemies, struck with a spell meant to bring ruin. The truth, if there was one, remained hidden. No physician could prove the cause. No priest could fully explain the punishment. And so, the mystery of the dancing plague lingered, a story that belonged to neither faith nor science, but to both. As the weeks turned to months, the city slowly returned to its ordinary life. Markets reopened, children played once more in the streets, and the bells of the cathedral rang out their familiar hours. Yet beneath the surface, Strasbourg was changed. Those who had danced bore scars, some physical, some of the soul. Families remembered the sight of their loved ones collapsing in exhaustion, or worse, dying with their feet still moving. And the city itself carried the weight of memory, a reminder that in one summer, reason had failed, and chaos had ruled. The story of the dancing plague would be told for centuries. Travelers carried it beyond Strasbourg, across Europe, and into the pages of history. Each retelling added new details, some true, some imagined, until the tale became both fact and a legend. Was it madness? Was it poison? Was it the wrath of a saint? The world could only wonder, but for those who had lived through it, no explanation was needed. They had seen it with their own eyes, the endless dance, the relentless rhythm, the terror of a city bound in movement. And no matter how much time passed, they would never forget the summer when Strasbourg could not stop dancing. To understand the dancing plague of 1518, one must step back and see the world as it was then. Strasbourg was not only a bustling city of trade and faith, it was also a place weighed down by hardship. The early 1500s were years of uncertainty and fear. The people of Strasbourg lived in a fragile balance. Their city was part of the Holy Roman Empire, a vast and complicated realm where politics and religion often collided. On the surface, life seemed ordinary. Merchants sold their wares, craftsmen worked their trades, and farmers from the surrounding countryside brought grain and produce to the markets. The great cathedral towered above the city, its spire pointing toward heaven, a reminder of divine power and judgment. But beneath this ordinary rhythm lay tension. Famine had struck in recent years, leaving many hungry and weak. Disease was never far away. The shadow of the Black Death, which had devastated Europe less than 2 centuries earlier, still haunted memory. Outbreaks of illness were common, and medical knowledge was limited. Physicians spoke of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, as if the balance of the human body could explain every sickness. Remedies were uncertain, often as dangerous as the diseases themselves. And then there was faith. In Strasbourg, as in much of Europe, religion was the core of daily life. Every bell of the cathedral reminded the people of their sins, of judgment, of the thin line between salvation and damnation. Saints were venerated, relics worshipped, and holy shrines sought for healing. The people lived with a constant awareness of God's hand in their lives, sometimes merciful, sometimes wrathful. It was in this environment, hungry, fearful, and deeply pious, that the dancing plague erupted. And perhaps that explains why it spread as it did. When one woman danced uncontrollably in the street, people did not see a medical condition. They saw a sign, a message from heaven, a warning, or a punishment, and belief has a power of its own. Strasbourg was not the first city to face such a phenomenon. Throughout medieval Europe, stories of dancing manias were whispered. As early as the 7th century, there were reports of groups of people convulsing, leaping, and dancing uncontrollably. In the 14th century, one of the most famous outbreaks occurred in the city of Aachen, where hundreds were said to have danced through the streets, singing and crying until they collapsed. Other accounts came from Italy, where the tarantella was believed to cure the bite of a spider by forcing victims to dance the poison away. These stories wove a tapestry of fear and fascination across Europe. The people called it Saint Vitus's dance, for the martyr's name was linked to trembling and convulsions. Pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to him were common remedies, much like the ones Strasbourg turned to in 1518. What made Strasbourg unique was not only the size of the outbreak, but also the detail in which it was recorded. Chroniclers of the time, including city officials and clergy, wrote down their observations. They described hundreds caught in the dance, some to the point of death. They told of the council's desperate measures, of music ordered into the streets, of families broken by exhaustion and fear. Their words carried the horror of eyewitnesses, ensuring that the plague of Strasbourg would not be forgotten. Still, explanations were scarce. In the centuries that followed, scholars debated the cause. Some favored the theory of ergot poisoning, that mold growing on rye had driven the people mad. Others leaned toward mass hysteria, a psychological outbreak fueled by fear and belief. Yet both explanations carried flaws. Ergot poisoning caused seizures and hallucinations, but rarely prolonged, synchronized movement. Mass hysteria explained the unity of the phenomenon. But could it truly kill by exhaustion? The truth may lie somewhere in between, a mix of body and mind, of sickness and belief. Hunger may have weakened the people, making them more vulnerable. Fear of sin and punishment may have shaped their thoughts. And once the first dancer began, the rest may have followed, trapped in a cycle of suggestion and desperation. But even if we can imagine the cause, the experience itself remains almost unimaginable. Picture the narrow streets of Strasbourg in the heat of July, filled with the constant sound of feet slamming against stone. Imagine walking through the marketplace and seeing dozens, then hundreds of neighbors swaying and convulsing, their faces pale with exhaustion, their eyes unfocused. Imagine trying to sleep at night while the sound of dancing drifted through the window, a rhythm that would not end. For the people of Strasbourg, this was not a story. It was life. Day after day, week after week, their city was consumed by the dance. No one knew if it would spread further, if all would be taken, if Strasbourg itself would fall. Every morning, they woke in dread. Who would be next? The dancing plague eventually ended as suddenly as it had begun. By September, the frenzy had faded. Whether it was the pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine, exhaustion that finally burned itself out, or some unseen change in the city's spirit, the madness released its grip. The streets grew quiet again. The markets reopened. Life, in its fragile rhythm, returned. But memory lingers longer than events. For generations, the story was told by merchants over ale, by mothers to their children, by priests from the pulpit. And with each retelling, the plague grew both stranger and more legendary. Some swore they had seen demons dancing among the people, invisible to all but the cursed. Others whispered that music itself had been cursed, that the notes of fiddles and drums carried enchantment. A few even claimed to hear the sound of footsteps in the square at night, long after the dancers had fallen. Legends blurred with fact, but the truth remained. In the summer of 1518, Strasbourg danced, not in joy, not in festival, but in compulsion, despair, and death. The dancing plague became part of Europe's memory, a tale that echoed alongside the horrors of famine, pestilence, and war. It reminded all who heard it of the fragility of human reason, of the thin line between order and chaos. And yet, beneath the horror, there was something hauntingly human in the tale. For though the dance brought suffering, it also revealed the depths of the human mind, the power of belief, the reach of fear, the strange ways in which the body and soul intertwine. The dancing plague was a mystery not only of illness, but of existence itself. The dancing plague of Strasbourg eventually faded into memory, but its shadow lingered. Even centuries later, the story was told and retold, always with the same question at its heart. Why? Why had hundreds of ordinary men, women, and children found themselves trapped in a dance that led some to death? Why had music, prayer, and medicine all failed? And why had the madness chosen that place, that summer, and those people? Modern minds are quick to search for answers in science. Many historians point to ergot fungus, the mold that thrives on rye during damp conditions. Its effects are well documented. It can cause spasms, hallucinations, and convulsions, much like those witnessed in Strasbourg. It was even linked to outbreaks of hysteria in later centuries, including speculation about the infamous Salem witch trials of the 17th century. If Strasbourg's bread was tainted, perhaps its citizens were unknowingly poisoned. Yet this theory has its limits. Ergot poisoning tends to strike individuals, not entire crowds. Its symptoms are varied and chaotic, not synchronized and uniform. And while it can certainly cause strange visions and frantic movement, it does not usually compel people to dance in unison for weeks on end. Another explanation rests in psychology. The early 16th century was a time of stress and fear. Famine weighed heavily on the poor. The threat of disease was ever present. Religious pressure was intense, with sermons constantly warning of sin, punishment, and damnation. In such an environment, the mind itself can become a fragile vessel. Some scholars believe the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, what we might call mass hysteria today. This is not as strange as it may sound. Human beings are social creatures, deeply influenced by what they see and hear around them. In moments of extreme stress, groups can fall into shared illusions and behaviors. History offers many examples. Schools of children suddenly struck by fainting spells, entire villages believing themselves cursed, soldiers panicking in unison without a visible enemy. The power of suggestion is stronger than we like to admit. If this was the case, then Frau Troffea's first steps were a spark. She may have been overwhelmed by grief, trauma, or illness. When others saw her movements, their minds, already fragile with hunger and fear, interpreted them as a sign of divine wrath or possession. One by one, they began to mirror her, and soon the dance became contagious, spreading not by blood or air, but by belief itself. The thought is chilling. It suggests that the human mind, under enough pressure, can create realities as powerful as any plague. The dancers of Strasbourg were not faking. Their bodies truly moved beyond their control. Yet the cause lay not in poison or spirit alone, but in the deep well of the collective human psyche. Even so, the mystery resists neat answers. Perhaps ergot played a part, weakening bodies and clouding minds. Perhaps faith and fear fueled the rest. Perhaps the truth is a tangled web of many threads, impossible to fully unravel. What is certain is the impact it left. Strasbourg learned, in the hardest of ways, how fragile the line is between order and chaos. In a single summer, their city was transformed into a place of madness. Their physicians, their priests, their leaders, all were powerless against a force that came not from an invading army, nor from plague or famine, but from within their own people. And this lesson has not faded with time. The dancing plague serves as a mirror, showing us the strange depths of the human condition. Even today, in a world of science and technology, we are not immune to collective fears and frenzies. We see it in sudden panics that sweep through crowds, in rumors that spread faster than fire, in beliefs that grip entire nations. We see it in stock markets that crash, in sudden waves of superstition, in the invisible but powerful force of mass suggestion. The dancers of Strasbourg remind us that human beings are vulnerable not only to sickness of the body, but also to sickness of the mind. And when the mind falters, the body may follow. Yet there is another lesson, quieter, but just as important. For all its horror, the dancing plague reveals the deep interconnectedness of people. A single woman's steps rippled outward into the lives of hundreds. Each person, watching, became part of the same strange rhythm. In joy or in madness, we are never alone. We share not only our triumphs, but our fears, our hopes, and our weaknesses. Perhaps this is why the story endures. Not only because it is strange and frightening, but because it speaks to something universal. We all know what it means to be swept up in forces beyond our control. We all know what it means to follow the crowd, to be moved by fear, by belief, by emotion stronger than reason. The dancers of Strasbourg lived this truth to its most extreme, paying for it with their bodies and, for some, their lives. When we picture them, their feet raw and bloody, their eyes vacant, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, we do not only see a historical curiosity, we see ourselves reflected in an ancient mirror, a reminder of what it means to be human. And so, the story of the dancing plague continues to echo, not as a closed chapter, but as a lingering question. Was it sickness? Was it madness? Was it punishment? The truth may never be known, but perhaps that is the point. For some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some are meant to be remembered, told again and again, so that we do not forget how fragile we are, how strange our minds can be, and how thin the veil is between order and chaos. When the streets of Strasbourg finally grew silent and the last exhausted feet had stilled, the city breathed as though waking from a nightmare. Yet the memory lingered, faint as a scar beneath the skin. The people who had watched their neighbors dance into madness did not forget. The ones who had felt the rhythm in their own trembling muscles carried it within them like a shadow, long after the summer had passed. Years later, the story was still told in whispers. In candle-lit rooms, families spoke of the woman who began it all, Frau Trophäa, the first dancer, whose steps seemed ordinary at first, but who had opened the door to something unearthly. Children sat wide-eyed as their elders described the endless pounding of feet against stone, the cries of exhaustion, the hollow eyes of men and women who could not stop. Some stories grew darker with each retelling, tales of figures glimpsed in the corners of vision, of unseen companions who joined the dancers only to vanish when looked at directly. In taverns, merchants recalled how trade had faltered, how the streets had been unusable, filled with writhing bodies. Travelers passing through carried the tale with them, spreading it to neighboring towns, then further still, until it became a tale known across Europe. Some repeated it with fascination, others with mockery, but all with a certain unease. For who could hear such a story without imagining what it would be like to be taken by the dance themselves? Legends have a way of softening truth, but also of making it eternal. And so, the dancing plague slipped into the realm of folklore. It was no longer only a record of what had happened in the summer of 1518. It was a caution, a fable, a mystery to stir both wonder and dread. For the people of Strasbourg, however, it was more than legend. The streets where the dancers had collapsed were still walked upon every day. The market square that had throbbed with the sound of frantic movement was still filled with merchants and children. But to those who had seen it, the stones themselves seemed to remember. Some swore they could still hear the echo of feet if they walked alone at night. Others avoided certain corners, believing that the madness had left traces there, invisible but waiting. Time has a way of softening wounds, yet never erasing them completely. 100 years later, chroniclers still wrote of the plague, their words tinged with both fascination and fear. They spoke of it not as a distant curiosity, but as a warning, proof that madness could strike without warning, that even the most ordinary city could become the stage for the extraordinary. And through the centuries, the tale remained. The Enlightenment came, bringing reason and science, yet still the dancing plague resisted explanation. Historians sought causes in fungus, in famine, in fear, but none could fully capture the strangeness of what had happened. And so the mystery endured, as alive in the imagination as it had been in the streets of Strasbourg. There is something timeless in the image. Hundreds of people swaying and spinning, trapped in a rhythm they could not escape. It is a vision that feels almost dreamlike, a scene from some forgotten myth. And perhaps that is why the story continues to fascinate us. It is neither holy history nor holy legend, but something in between, a liminal place where fact and fable dance together. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of feet against stone, the murmur of a crowd watching in awe and horror, the slow swell of music meant to soothe, but instead inflaming the frenzy, and within it all, the beating of countless hearts, racing faster and faster as though caught in a storm. The people of Strasbourg did not choose their fate. They were swept into it, carried like leaves in the wind. Some fought, some prayed, some surrendered, but in the end, they were all part of the same dance, bound together in suffering, fear, and mystery. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of the plague, that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, forces we cannot always see or understand. The people danced not as individuals, but as a collective, moved by something stronger than will. It may have been madness, it may have been faith, it may have been poison, but whatever it was, it bound them together, body and soul, until they could not escape. In this sense, the dancing plague is less a story of illness than of humanity. It shows us how easily the lines blur between the physical and the spiritual, between body and mind. It shows us that belief itself can shape reality, that fear can spread like fire, that joy and despair alike can be contagious. And so, as the centuries passed, the story of Strasbourg was not forgotten. It was carried forward in books, in songs, in hushed voices around hearths. It became part of the tapestry of human history, one of those strange, haunting reminders that the world is full of mysteries we cannot tame. Even now, in the modern age, when the streets of Strasbourg are filled with tourists and the hum of ordinary life, the memory lingers. The stones of the old city have seen it all. The markets, the wars, the celebrations, and yes, the dance. They are silent, but they remember. If you walk there at night, when the city is quiet and the cathedral bells have fallen still, you might feel it, a faint vibration underfoot, as if somewhere deep beneath the stones the rhythm continues. And perhaps, in some way, it does. For every time the story is told, the dancers rise again in memory. Every word spoken about them is another step, another echo, another reminder that the past never fully dies. It lingers, waiting, as alive in our imagination as it ever was in reality. The dancing plague of 1518 may never be explained. It may never be solved or fully understood. But it does not need to be, for it is not only a puzzle of history, it is a parable, a mirror, a haunting reminder of what it means to be human. And in that sense, the dance has never truly ended. Human beings have always sought meaning in the strange. When lightning split the sky, our ancestors saw the hand of gods. When sickness swept through villages, they imagined curses or spirits. And when people in Strasbourg danced themselves toward death, the witnesses searched for explanations just as fervently. For to live with mystery is to live with unease, and the human heart craves order, even when none exists. The dancing plague is one such riddle, part history, part legend, part mirror reflecting our endless hunger to explain the unexplainable. What happened in Strasbourg was real. Too many records remain. Too many witnesses spoke. But what it meant has shifted with every age, reshaped by the questions each generation brings. For the people of the 16th century, the answer was spiritual. They saw the wrath of Saint Vitus or the punishment of God. In a world where faith was woven into every breath, such an explanation felt natural. To them, the plague was a warning. Live more purely, repent, or suffer divine anger. For physicians of the time, the explanation was humours gone awry, blood too hot, bile too unbalanced. To them, the dance was an illness. One more strange malady in a world full of mysteries the body could hide. For us today, the possibilities are broader. We speak of fungi and toxins, of stress and hysteria, of the fragile architecture of the mind. We want the dance to fit into categories we understand, for to leave it unbound is to accept that not all things can be explained. Yet perhaps that is the true power of the story, that it resists neat answers. It reminds us of the limits of our knowledge, no matter how advanced our science or strong our faith. There will always be mysteries that sit just beyond our grasp, reminding us that the world is older, stranger, and more complex than we imagine. The dancing plague is not alone in this. History is full of enigmas that refuse resolution. The oracles of Delphi speaking in riddles from smoke-filled chambers. The sudden appearances of ghost lights over marshes, leading travellers astray. The tales of entire villages struck by laughter or fainting, spreading like wildfire through the people. Each of these is a thread in the same tapestry, a reminder that humanity moves not only through reason, but also through wonder. And wonder is not always gentle. Sometimes it terrifies, sometimes it unsettles, sometimes it leaves us awake at night, imagining footsteps echoing where none should be. When we think of the dancers of Strasbourg, we see more than history. We see ourselves reflected in their helpless movements. We too live in uncertain times. We too face fears we cannot control. And when the weight grows heavy, when our spirits are pressed, we search for release. Sometimes it comes in song, sometimes in tears, sometimes in laughter. And in Strasbourg, it came in dance. It is worth asking, what will future generations think of us? What mysteries will they see in our actions? What puzzles will they try to untangle? Just as we search for answers in the plague of 1518, they may search for answers in the strange rhythms of our own age. Perhaps that is the deeper truth of such stories. They are not only about what happened then, they are about what happens always. The details shift, the settings change, but the essence remains. People confronted by the unknown, struggling to weave it into meaning. And so, the dancing plague lives on, not only as an event, but as a parable. It tells us that the human body is fragile, the mind even more so. It tells us that belief can spread faster than fire, and that fear can take shape in ways that seem almost alive. It tells us that communities are bound together, not only in joy, but also in despair, each person's fate touching the next. But it also tells us something subtler, something quieter. That mystery itself has value. That not everything must be solved to be meaningful. That some stories are most powerful precisely because they refuse to be tamed by reason. Imagine for a moment that the plague had been simple, that we could say with certainty it was fungus, or madness, or sin. Would it linger in our memory with such force? Would it haunt the imagination, inspire books, songs, and whispered tales for 500 years? Perhaps not. Perhaps it endures because it remains just out of reach, inviting us to wonder, to fear, to reflect. And in that way, the dancers are still with us. Each time we tell their story, each time we imagine their steps echoing in the summer heat, we join the dance ourselves, not in body, but in mind. We become part of the chain, stretching back through centuries, bound by curiosity and awe. Some say that myths are the dreams of humanity, carried forward through time. If that is true, then the dancing plague is a dream of frenzy, of release, of fear made flesh. It is a dream that reminds us how close we are to chaos, how thin the walls are between reason and madness. But it is also, strangely, a dream of unity. For in their suffering, the dancers were not alone. They moved together, bound in the same rhythm. Their steps were tragic, yes, but they were also shared. And perhaps that is why their story still speaks to us, not only because it was strange, but because it was deeply, hauntingly human. So let us not think only of the horror, though there was plenty. Let us also think of the humanity, of neighbors carrying each other to shrines, of families praying beside their loved ones, of a city grappling with the incomprehensible. For even in madness, there was compassion. Even in chaos, there was care. And that, too, is part of the legacy of Strasbourg. Not only the madness of the dance, but the endurance of those who lived through it. Not only the terror of the unknown, but the resilience of a people who returned to life when it was over. The plague is gone, but its memory is not. And so long as the story is told, it will never be. When the summer of 1518 passed into autumn, Strasbourg began to heal. The air grew cooler, the harvest ripened in the fields, and the shadows of the cathedral stretched long across the cobblestones as the days shortened. The noise that had once filled the city, the relentless pounding of feet, the cries of exhaustion, was gone. Silence, heavy and fragile, returned. For weeks, the citizens had lived with chaos. They had watched loved ones fall into madness, had seen neighbors collapse and rise again, as if bound to invisible strings. They had smelled the sweat of fever, had heard the endless rhythm of bodies that refused to rest. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The dancers lay still, or slept, or faded into memory. The city exhaled. Life resumed, though never quite as it had been before. The marketplace once again rang with the voices of merchants, the laughter of children, the bargaining of customers. Bakers kneaded their dough, cobblers hammered leather, fishermen sold their catch along the river. To any visitor, Strasbourg looked as it always had, a thriving city on the Rhine, alive with trade and faith. Yet for those who had been there, the silence carried weight. People avoided speaking of the plague too openly, as if naming it might call it back. Families grieved quietly for those who had died. Survivors lived with the scars, some physical, their bodies weakened by exhaustion, others invisible, lingering in the mind. Imagine the thoughts of those who had danced. To awaken after weeks of feverish movement, to find your feet bloodied and your strength gone, must have been like waking from a dream. Terrifying, vivid, yet somehow distant. Some likely wondered if it had been real at all. Yet their families remembered, the city remembered, and the stones themselves seemed to remember. As autumn deepened, Strasbourg's council tried to leave the matter behind. There were taxes to collect, disputes to settle, laws to enforce, but beneath the rhythm of ordinary life, the memory pulsed quietly, like a hidden drumbeat. For every person who walked through the marketplace, there was the faint reminder, this is where it happened. This is where the dance consumed us. Over the years, the story passed into legend. Travelers told it in distant cities, adding their own colors, shaping it into fable. Some said the dancers had laughed as they died, others that they had screamed. Some claimed musicians played until their fingers bled, powerless to stop the madness. Still others whispered that at night, under the moon, the dancers' shadows still moved, long after their bodies were gone. In truth, no one knows exactly how it ended. Some chroniclers said the shrine of Saint Vitus brought peace. Others believed exhaustion simply burned the fever away. Whatever the case, the people of Strasbourg carried on, as people always do. They worked, they prayed, they celebrated births and mourned deaths. Yet deep down, the memory remained, etched into the soul of the city. And perhaps that is the most haunting part, not the event itself, but its echo. For centuries later, we still speak of it. We still imagine the dancers, their feet striking stone in relentless rhythm, their bodies trembling, their eyes distant. We still wonder what drove them, what force, divine, natural, or psychological, bound them to that fatal dance. The city of Strasbourg stands today, modern and alive. Cars move along streets where horses once trod. Tourists photograph the great cathedral, its spires still piercing the sky. Cafes and shops line the marketplace where Frau Trophäa first began her strange steps. Life has gone on, as it always does, yet the story lingers, invisible but present, like a whisper carried on the wind. If you were to stand there now, in the quiet of evening, you might not see anything unusual. The cobblestones are the same, though smoothed by centuries of feet. The air carries the scent of food and wine, not sweat and fear. The laughter of children still echoes, as it did long ago. But if you close your eyes, you might imagine it, the faint echo of a rhythm, long silenced, a sound just beneath hearing, as though the city itself remembers. And perhaps that is enough. Some mysteries do not need solving. Some stories do not need endings. They remain with us because they remind us of something deeper, that life is fragile, that the mind is powerful, that the line between order and chaos is thin as silk. The dancing plague of 1518 was not just an illness, nor just a legend. It was both and more. It was a mirror held up to humanity, showing us what we fear and what we long for, what we cannot control and what we cannot forget. And so, as you listen to this story, as the images of Strasbourg form in your mind, the cobblestone streets, the spire of the cathedral, the swaying forms of dancers, you are part of its legacy. For every retelling brings it back, keeps it alive, lets it echo once more. The dancers are gone. Their feet no longer bleed, their voices no longer cry, but their memory moves on, step after step, century after century. And when we tell their story, we too are dancing, if only in thought. So let the story rest here, in silence, in reflection. Let the city of Strasbourg sleep in peace, its stones cooled by time, its markets alive once more. Let the dancers, wherever they are, find rest at last. And as you drift into sleep, remember, the world is full of mysteries. Some frighten us, some fascinate us, and some, like the dance of Strasbourg, do both at once. We may never know their cause, we may never solve their riddle, but perhaps that is the beauty of it. For mystery itself is a kind of music. And sometimes, if we listen closely, we can still hear the faintest of rhythms guiding us, haunting us, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. Centuries passed, and yet the memory of the dancers did not fade. In Strasbourg, the story was carried from parent to child, from priest to congregation, from traveller to traveller. Each retelling shifted the details, shaped by the fears and beliefs of the age. But always, at its core, remained the vision of men-women swaying uncontrollably through the streets, their bodies trapped in a rhythm they could not master. For the people of the 1600s, the plague was a moral tale. Priests used it in sermons as a warning. Sin leads to chaos. Indulgence invites punishment. The dancers were portrayed not only as victims of sickness, but as symbols of what happens when faith falters. They were reminders of divine wrath, their suffering proof that no city could ignore the hand of heaven. By the Enlightenment of the 1700s, thinkers sought different explanations. The age of reason frowned upon miracles and curses. Scholars began to treat the plague as a curiosity of the human body and mind. Some wrote that it must have been caused by poor diet and poisoned grain. Others that it was evidence of psychological frailty. The story was retold in letters and books, not as a miracle, but as a puzzle, a strange footnote in the growing catalogue of medical knowledge. In the 1800s, the tale acquired yet another flavour. The Romantic movement, fascinated by mystery and the uncanny, seized upon the dancing plague as an image of human fragility. Poets and artists imagined the dancers as tragic figures swept up in forces beyond themselves, their frenzy a symbol of passion unbound. Paintings showed ghostly crowds whirling under the moon, their faces pale, their eyes vacant. For the Romantics, Strasbourg's tragedy was no longer only a warning or a medical puzzle. It was also a metaphor for the storms of the human soul. And in the 1900s, historians revisited the records with fresh eyes. They sought not only to explain the dance, but to place it within its context, an age of famine, plague, and religious fear. They saw in it the marks of stress and desperation, the collective breakdown of a people burdened beyond their strength. Some drew parallels to modern outbreaks of mass hysteria, schools of children struck with fainting fits, factories where workers convulsed in unison, entire communities convinced of invisible poisons. Yet even in modern times, the mystery resists closure. For every theory, there are questions left unanswered. Why did the dancers move in unison rather than scatter in individual convulsions? Why did it last for weeks, consuming hundreds? Why Strasbourg and not another city in that summer of 1518? The more we seek to explain it, the more the story slips through our fingers, like sand refusing to be grasped. And perhaps that is why it endures. A solved mystery is soon forgotten. An unsolved one lives forever. Today, the dancing plague is remembered in many ways. Scholars still write papers debating its cause. Novelists and filmmakers draw inspiration from its haunting images. Tourists walk through Strasbourg, unaware that the cobblestones beneath their feet once throbbed with the steps of madness. The cathedral still stands, its bells still tolling, as it did during those terrible weeks. The city has grown, changed, modernized, but the shadow of the dance lingers, if only in story. And beyond Strasbourg, the tale continues to ripple outward. It has become a universal parable, told in classrooms, whispered in documentaries, passed through podcasts and books. Each generation finds something different in it. For some, it is a warning of hysteria and fear. For others, it is a lesson in compassion, reminding us how fragile and human we all are. For still others, It is simply a fascinating mystery, one that sparks the imagination and unsettles the heart. When we listen to the story today, we are not so different from those who listened centuries ago. We too live in a world of uncertainty. We too face crises that strain our minds and bodies. We too search for meaning in the unexplainable. And so, the dancers of Strasbourg speak to us still, their silent footsteps echoing across 500 years. There is something haunting in the thought that their movements might never truly have ended, that in some way the rhythm they began continues invisibly, pulsing through time, that whenever we tell their story, we awaken it again, bringing their steps back to life in memory and imagination. Close your eyes, and you might see them. A summer sun beating down on cobblestones, a woman stepping into the street, swaying with a rhythm no one else can hear, a crowd gathering, puzzled, then fearful, then swept into the same strange current, a city drowning in footsteps, unable to stop the tide. The scene is vivid, as though it might be happening not 5 centuries ago, but now, just beyond your door. That is the power of legend. It collapses time, binding the past and present into a single thread. And the dancing plague, more than most, has that power. It is not merely a relic of history. It is a living echo, one that reminds us that the boundaries between order and chaos, reason and madness, faith and fear, are fragile still. Strasbourg sleeps now. Its people walk peacefully through the same streets, unaware of the shadows beneath their feet. But somewhere, in the stones, in the stories, in the whispers of history, the dancers remain. Not visible, not audible, but present. A memory, a lesson, a haunting. And as long as the story is told, the dance will never truly be over. The story of the dancing plague is nearly 500 years old, yet it lingers like a faint echo. We do not feel the heat of that summer in 1518, nor hear the pounding feet with our own ears. But through words, through memory, through legend, it comes alive again. And in its quiet way, it asks us to listen. Strasbourg has changed. The city that once trembled with the rhythm of madness is now modern, its streets filled with cars and voices in many languages. Yet the stones remain. They have seen merchants come and go, empires rise and fall, wars sweep across the land. And they have also seen the dance. Perhaps they remember, in the way that places sometimes do. If you walk there at night, long after the tourists have gone, you may hear nothing but the wind along the river and the bells of the cathedral in the distance. Yet you might imagine it, the faintest echo of footsteps, too soft to be real, too steady to be chance. A rhythm not heard but felt, as if the past were breathing just beneath the present. The dancers are gone, their bodies long returned to dust. But their story is alive, and so, in a way, they are alive too. Every time it is told, they rise again in memory. Frau Trophäa swaying under the summer sun, neighbors staring in shock, crowds swept into frenzy. Their exhaustion, their cries, their trembling forms step out of silence and into our thoughts. And as we listen, we are reminded of something larger, that mystery has its own power. The world is not made only of answers. It is also made of questions, of echoes, of things we cannot quite hold. The dancing plague is one of those mysteries. Perhaps it was illness. Perhaps it was hysteria. Perhaps it was something else entirely. We may never know. And perhaps that is all right. For what matters is not the solution, but the story. The story tells us of fragility, of community, of belief. It tells us that the line between order and chaos is thinner than we think. And it tells us that even in darkness, people endure, carrying one another through what cannot be explained. And as you drift into sleep, carry with you this truth, that the world is vast, mysterious, and full of wonders we do not yet understand. Some of them frighten us, some comfort us, some, like the dance of Strasbourg, do both at once. Listen closely, and perhaps you can still hear it, the faintest of rhythms, distant yet familiar, reminding you that the past is never truly gone. It moves through us, step by step, whisper by whisper, like a dance that has no end,